Yeah, so to start off with the seminar, welcome everyone to this week's webinar series for the PhD reading group on storytelling in academic writing that is hosted by the AOM IM Division Doctoral Student Committee. So hi, my name is Ki-Jong Kim, and I'm from the University of South Carolina, Moore School of Business, and I will be co-hosting this webinar with Afshin Hamrabadi from the University of Trento in Italy. So for this week's reading group, it is our pleasure to present you our guest speaker, Professor Tim Pollock from the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, who is an expert on this domain. So just to provide some background information, Professor Tim Pollock is the Haslam Chair in Business. He is a distinguished professor of entrepreneurship and the Kinney Family Faculty Research Fellow. He's also an international research fellow with the Oxford University Center for Corporate Reputation and also a research fellow for Haslam Neil's Corporate Governance Center. So for his academic services, he has served as the associate editor for the Academy of Management Journal and currently is or has been a member of the editorial boards of the Academy of Management Review, Administrative Science Quarterly, Journal of Business Venturing, Organizational Science, and Strategic Organization. Also, his research lies in the realms of corporate governance, which he has published also in leading academic journals, such as Administrative Science Quarterly, Academy of Management Journal, Academy of Management Review, Organizational Science, and Strategic Management Journal, and this is just to name a few. He has also co-edited the books, the Oxford Handbook of Corporate Reputation and Corporate Reputation Critical Perspectives on Business and Management, and has also authored the book, How to Use Storytelling in Your Academic Writing, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with by now. So without further ado, I'll open the floor to you, Tim.
Thanks, Kijong. I appreciate it. Thank you for inviting me. I'm going to move you all over to my other screen here so I can not block my slides. If hopefully everybody can see this okay. So I'm delighted to be here today. I'm looking forward to answering your questions as well. So the plan is for me to take about 30 to 40 minutes to talk about using storytelling in your academic writing and give you some background on it, and then Kijong, I think, is going to ask me some curated questions that you all had submitted as part of your when you signed up, and then we'll open the floor to anybody else who, if we have time, who wants to ask any additional questions. So I'll go ahead and get started. So I think we have a super cool job, because what our job essentially is to think up interesting unanswered questions or questions that have been answered well, figure out how to do it, answer the questions, and then tell the story. And most of the focus in your doctoral programs and our training and so forth has been on the first parts, identifying what's an interesting question, to learning about methods and research design and so forth. And we spend very little time actually talking about how do we tell the story and how do we present it in the most effective way so that people see what we see in our interesting findings, and in particular understand why something occurs, because that's what we're doing in our stories. We're not describing just what happens, but theory explains why it happens, and that's what we're developing, and that's the story that we're trying to tell. So to do this, I argue that you need to tell a compelling story. The stories are the most powerful delivery tool that we have for information. You can have a couple famous storytellers here, Steve Jobs and Martin Luther King Jr., who were incredibly effective and persuasive in very different realms, but both were gifted storytellers and did a really good, and were able to project their messages in a way that got people excited, interested, connected with them, and led them to act on their stories. So that's what an effective story does. Effective storytelling delivers information, of course, but it also conveys experiences that you've had and develops shared experiences with others. Ideally, it will inspire action. In our case, hopefully that means people read and cite and build on our work. But stories also entertain, and I know you probably don't think of an academic research article as particularly entertaining oftentimes, but I think the good ones actually are. I mean, they pull you in, they draw you along, and so you can be entertaining in what you're doing as well as conveying information and hopefully inspiring action. So there are a number of
Hi,
benefits.
hi, Tim. Sorry to interrupt. I think the
Yeah,
slides aren't moving on the shared screen.
they are not moving.
Yeah,
Okay, oh, sorry, shit, okay. Let me see if I'm sharing the wrong thing. We try a new share. So are you seeing, what are you seeing?
maybe stop.
Okay, okay, I think it's working now. Here, let me see. Okay, can you see? Okay,
Yes, yes.
okay,
Yes,
okay, can you see that full? Okay, so you're going, what are you showing me? You're talking, but you're not. Can you see it? Did you see it change? Can you see
Yeah.
telling a compelling story? Awesome. Okay, so here's my pictures, effective storytelling with my good animation. Um, and the benefits for academics. So one of the most important things a story does is it frames how others interpret your work. Data does not speak for itself. People think, oh well, all I got to do is present the results, and that's it. That's not going to help you, because most of the time the data needs to be interpreted through some sort of frame of reference, and you want readers to use your frame of reference, not a different frame of reference or their own frame of reference when they're interpreting and understanding your work. And the more effective you are in telling the story, the more likely they are to adopt your frame as opposed to impose some other frame and then get out of your work and understand the data in the same way that you do. If you are a good storyteller, you also tend to be a more successful publisher. People who can tell effective stories and interesting stories have greater success getting through the review process. You have greater influence because people will tend to read and remember your articles more and then want to read what you wrote, and will cite your work because they understand what it contributes, and they buy into the story, and hopefully build on your work. It also makes you more attractive as a co-author. There are lots of people who are really good at analyzing data and collecting data. There are fewer people who are really good, effective writers and good storytellers. And those who are, it's a great skill set to have, and people will invite you onto papers because of your writing skill and ability. Or they may have I've had a number of projects where I've effectively acted as a script doctor, where they've done a project, they maybe have submitted to a journal or two, it's gotten rejected. Often they're friends of mine, they ask me for a friendly review, I give them some feedback and they say, hey, would you be interested in joining the project? And then because of what I bring to the table in terms of the writing and the storytelling, then we can move it forward. So people look for that, and if you can develop this skill and people know you're good at it, they will come to you and ask you to join them on projects, which can make you a more productive author as well. So it's an important, valuable skill to try to develop. And even if you decide, I don't want to be, I'm not going to be a great writer, but the more effective you are in telling your story, the more likely people are, and the better writer you are, the more likely people are going to want to work with you, just because it's less painful to try to develop a paper together if the people you're working with are decent writers, as opposed to you having to rewrite every word that they say. So there's a difference between writing and typing. So when and where do you write? I think most people probably would say some version of what they're doing right now, sitting in front of their computer. But I argue that that's only one place where we write, that we're actually writing all the time and everywhere. So when you're thinking about your study, how to frame it, if you're walking the dog, making dinner, mowing the lawn, on a hike, doing dishes, these are all places where I find myself actually writing, besides just when I'm typing in front of the computer, because because I may be thinking about my study, thinking about how to frame things, how to structure the story, solving problems. I oftentimes get a lot of my aha insights when I'm doing something like this, where it's I'm doing something physical, but it's not cognitively taxing. So my mind can kind of let loose and operate, and the subconscious can come up and solve these problems. So when you think about writing, I think a lot of people freeze up when it comes to that, sitting in front of the keyboard and typing. But if you recognize that's just only one place where this happens, it helps you take a broader perspective on what it means to write and to be a writer. So I don't know if I can see as many people as I can here, but show of hands, you can use like the little hand thing. How many people struggle and feel like they're constrained by working within the format of a particular article? I don't know if you can see hands with the things off. So okay. We're seeing some hands here. So okay, good. So I argue that it's a lot of people say that this is hard for them. That one of the biggest challenges is going to be is that they feel they're constrained by the structure or working within a format. But I would or that they can't be as creative as they would like to be. But I would argue, does that mean that you can't be creative writing a haiku, which is only 3 lines and 17 syllables? Or be creative writing a sonnet, which is 3 quatrains and a couplet so it's about 17 lines of about 10 syllables each in iambic pentameter. So these are very constraining structures. If you write poetry, if you write a symphony, if you write a novel, these are all specific formats or types that constrain what you do, but it's working within that structure that allows you to be creative. If you know anybody or have any experience with advertising creatives, they will tell you the worst thing you can do is to just give them a blank slate, that they want to have the boundaries that they need to work within, and that allows them to be creative. And I would argue that's the same for the general format of an academic research article, because there are a number of benefits to our structure. So the creativity doesn't come in the layout or the organization of the information, but it comes in what you say within the structure. One of the things that our structure does is it makes it easier to convey information, because although we all like to believe that everybody's going to read every one of our articles from the very first word to the very last word and pour over all of them, from your own experience that's not how you read an academic article. Most people don't. I mean, oftentimes you'll be reading for particular things. So you might just be looking at the introduction to understand what the paper's about. You might be looking for something in the methods section, or looking for a particular result, or looking for how they developed an argument. And then you may go back and read more of the paper if it's especially important to what you're doing and to your research. But we rarely read the things from front to back. And knowing how an article is structured makes it easier for you to go find the information that you want from that article. If I know how the article is laid out, I know where to go to look to find what it is that I need to take from the article. It also creates familiarity. We're going to be more comfortable with what's going on and understanding and knowing what's going to come next, because we're familiar with the form and with the structure of the article. And because of this, it also helps facilitate understanding. I can find the information that I need. I can follow your stories. I can follow your arguments. And so it makes it easier for your readers to understand where you're coming from. So rather than fighting against the structure of an academic article, I'd encourage you to think about embracing it and then think about how to be creative within that structure and how to convey your story in the most effective way possible. So before I talk about Freytag's pyramid, story. So what is a story? And all academic articles can be stories. So a story is a whole action that has a beginning and a middle and an end. And I like the metaphor of tying and untying a knot, to think about what you're doing when you're telling a story or presenting a drama. So in the first part of the story, you are introducing characters, you're developing, you're creating the setting, but you're also introducing complications or challenges or tensions that need to be resolved. So every story has to have some sort of a tension, as does every academic research study. And so what you're doing in a story is you're first tying the knot, you're creating that tension, you're bringing it to its maximum level, and then you're untying the knot, you're releasing the tension, and you're helping people see what happens. So if you think about when you're writing an article, what part of this, am I tying the knot or am I untying the knot? Where am I in that process? I think it's a really useful metaphor for thinking about and approaching how you write your articles. So Freytag's pyramid is a nice way of thinking about how to do this. So Gustav Freytag was a 19th century drama theorist, and what he did was he took the 5 elements of a classical drama and structured them in a pyramid format. And so and I'm going to go through each of these 5 elements or 5 stages of a drama, and then show how they can be overlaid on academic research articles. So the first part of the drama is the exposition. So you think about the start of a movie, the start of a story. The exposition is providing us background information. So it's introducing the characters, it's establishing the context, it's the setting, it's the way the world currently is. And we typically find our protagonists, our hero in our story, in their world as it currently is, and they're going along with their lives. And so it's providing all this background information so that we understand the settings and some of the players involved. But at some point, there's a precipitating action, and that starts the rising action. The rising action is where our hero, our protagonist, starts encountering some obstacles or conflicts or challenges that they have to go overcome, and it ratchets up the tension in the story about what's happening. They may have some setbacks. There may be an antagonist that they're competing against, but the tension continues to grow as the knot gets tied during the rising action. But the rising action may also provide some seeds of how the problem or the challenge might be resolved. So the climax is the point of maximum tension. This is the turning point in the story for our hero. There's some sort of key event, and so you'll notice on the pyramid, unlike all the other parts, this is a point, not a line, not a segment. And so what's happening here is that okay, now we're turning, and that's leading us into the falling action. And the falling action is when the knot gets untied, so that we find out what happens. We see if our hero succeeds or if they fail. There can be twists and turns along the way, so it's not just a straight, outlining. There may be some more challenges or bumps in the road, but by the end of the falling action, we know what's happened. The story, the outcome has been resolved for whatever the journey our hero was on, whatever their challenges were. We know what the outcomes were. And that leads us to the denouement, which is the final part of a story. And this is where the audience is given what's called catharsis, that it's the authors or the storytellers make sense of what's happened. Our hero is in a new normal. They're in a new place, different from where they were in the exposition when they started. Their world's at a different position. If we had more than one character going on the journey together, their paths may split at this point, and each character may be going on a different journey at this point, and there may be future stories. So it's not an ending necessarily to the story, but it's an ending to this chapter of the story. They may have other adventures in their future, and so that's the structure that this follows. So I argue this actually overlays really nicely onto academic research articles. And so this is applying the Freytag's pyramid to a quantitative article structure. So if you think about the different pieces of a typical quantitative study, the exposition typically involves the introduction and sometimes early parts of the theory development. Because what we do in an introduction is we're introducing our key characters. We're saying, here's what we know about the literature. So we're saying, here's how the world exists as it is now. But then we're trying to create some dissatisfaction with it too. We say, here there are problems with it. And we may, talk a little bit more about our context and what's going on. And although the introduction, unlike the exposition in a drama, doesn't give you the ending right away, we have to do that in our academic research. The goal is with the introduction is to have people be interested enough in what's going on that they want to, even if they know roughly what the ending is going to be, they want to see how we got there. They want to see the rest of the story. And the theory development section sometimes is part of this. So we may have more exposition, or we're defining constructs, explaining more about our context, something like that, in the initial parts and as part of the literature review. And so that would really kind of fall as more of an expositional portion of the paper. But then we start developing our hypotheses, and that's where we start tying the knot. Because what you've done through your introduction in the early part and through your theory development section is you're creating a tension. There's something wrong with the current state of the world. There's something we don't know, or some challenge that we have. And now we're going to start to elaborate on that. And so as you develop your hypotheses and your arguments, what you're doing is you're tying the knot. You're saying here's some questions. Here's our hypothesis about how this unexplained thing or underexplored thing would work, but we don't know if you're right or not. So there's still some tension there. So even though you're making your arguments, we don't know if they work. And I argue that the methods are also part of the rising action, because even after you've described your story, now you have to tell us how you're actually going to go about doing it. How are you going to test your story? How are you going to construct your measures and variables? And even if you do a good job doing that, we still don't know, do they work or do they not work? So that's where we get to the beginning of the results section. That's our climax. So we fully tied the knot. We haven't started with the following action yet, but this is typically where we're, presenting our descriptive statistics and talking about how we tested for collinearity and it's not a problem, all this kind of stuff. It's all that preamble before we actually start saying, here's what we found. And so for me, that's typically the climax in a quantitative study. And then the following action are where we present and describe and discuss our hypothesis tests, any post hoc analysis we did, any robustness tests that we do. And so we find out, was the hypothesis supported? Was it not supported? Maybe do we find an opposite effect to what we predicted? And are there any boundaries that maybe we put on this by doing some robustness tests? Or is there a post hoc analysis that we can do that provides some unique insight that wasn't part of our initial story, but really adds to our story? But we're untying the knot through this whole thing. And by the end of the results section, we know what the findings were, right? So that's been laid out. And sometimes a little bit of the beginning of the discussion where we recap our findings is also part of that following action. But then the discussion is the denouement. This is where we are taking our findings, we're tying them back to the theory, we're elaborating on what's new and interesting about our theory, we're making sense of the world and saying, here's how the world is now different than it was at the beginning of my article, before we saw what I did, what I wrote, what we found. And then as we write up our limitations, our future research directions, these are where our actors, our new adventures may be coming from, and setting the stage for future research. And then we want to have some sort of a conclusion that brings it all back together and ties back to the introduction in some way that to close out our story. So that's how I would argue we can apply storytelling structure to a quantitative article. And I'm going to give you guys an example of this at the end, so you get it. So it's not. So I'm not just going to be talking about it on the abstract. I'll show you what this looks like with one of my papers. Qualitative structures are relatively similar. The introduction and the theoretical background are typically parts of the exposition. And the remainder of the theoretical background, where we're setting up what's missing from the literature, but also our discussion of research context and methods are part of the rising action. So this is actually shorter and quicker than you typically find in a quantitative article, because the new theory development's all in the back end of a qualitative paper. So the beginning of the findings section is the climax, and then the findings, where we're telling our thick description, laying out the story, showing what we found, developing our models, doing our comparisons of our cases, whatever sort of qualitative study you're doing is laid out. And perhaps the beginning of the discussion section, if you're using a summarizing figure at the end, could also be part of that following action where you bring it all together. And then the discussion is again the denouement, but this is where the new theory is. Unlike a quantitative paper where most of the new theory, although there can be new theory and discussion sections of quantitative papers too, unsupported or surprise findings, unsupported findings, post hoc analysis can all be opportunities for new theorizing in the discussion. But the discussion section's purpose in a qualitative paper is to then develop the theory, bring things up a level of abstraction, tie it back, and show how we're in a new place and have a new understanding because of these findings. So the same structure can also be applied to a theory article. So same introduction, beginning of the theoretical background, again, can be the exposition. The theoretical background and problem development, why you're doing what you're doing, what you're theorizing about, again, will be the rising action and can be relatively short. We have no data, so there is no methods or results to talk about here. So that means your theoretical deliverable So whatever it is that you are developing your theory about, that is the falling action in a theory paper. So whereas that would be part of the rising action in a quantitative paper because you're developing your theoretical model and then laying it out, here, that's the purpose of the paper. That's what you're trying to say. We don't understand or have theory to explain this, and then you present it. So whether it's a typology or a process model or a theoretical model or whatever it is that your theoretical deliverable is, that's the falling action. And then the discussion is going to tend to be a lot shorter and focus more on implications of your study for theory, for practice, how to test it empirically, things like that. You don't have to kind of spend a lot of time going through what the theoretical deliverable was about again, because you just spent half your paper doing that. So it tends to be shorter, and this ties it up and sets it up for future research. So we'll talk a little bit about characters. Who are the characters in your story? Your characters are not the companies or people or industries that you are studying. Your characters are your theoretical constructs. And so you want to think about, as I'm telling my story, so if you're going to think about, well, how do I apply this and how do I use storytelling in a study? Think of your theoretical constructs as your characters, and you're going to have different types of characters. You're going to have your main character. So this is who the story is about. These are the folks that are taking the journey. So in my South Park example, it's Kyle, Kenny, Stan, and Cartman. So they can be, so your main characters can be independent variables only if you're really interested in the dynamics or the effects of a particular IV or relationships among IVs, predicting some sort of a DV that'd be more of a supporting character. They could be DVs only if you're interested in the DV as an outcome, or it could be a relationship between IVs and DVs. That's your main character. But these are the constructs you're going to develop the most fully and that carry through the whole story. The supporting characters play a significant role in your story, and you're going to develop them, but the story is not about them. They tend to appear only in part of the story, and they may help the main characters along on their journey. They could be main effect independent variables or dependent variables. So for example, if your main characters are independent variables and you're predicting firm performance or level of internationalization. Internationalization or firm performance might be your supporting character. That's the outcome you're predicting, but what you're really interested in is the things that are affecting that. And so those are the main characters in your story. In other stories, they might be the main characters themselves. Oftentimes, supporting characters show up as moderators or mediators in the story as well. So you can see that. So they help the story along by telling us how they're going to shape the nature of the relationship or the journey that the main characters are taking. And then our ensemble are the rest of the characters in their story. These are the folks who play very small roles. They might appear briefly within the story, but they're just there to help basically fill out the scene, fill out the story. In our case, they're typically control variables in our models, and you can think of that as that. They need to be there. They need to be part of the story, but they're not. The story isn't about them, and they're not really playing a significant role in the story, but they're helping flesh it out. Another element of storytelling that you need to consider are themes and storylines, and these are related but different things. So the theme is what a story is about. So I like superhero movies, and so we got the Marvel Cinematic Universe down here. And if any of you have watched any of these movies, you'll recognize some of these characters. And most of these folks that we see have their own movies and have had dominant storylines, but they also appear in other characters' movies. And there was an ongoing theme that tied across a lot of them about dealing with the challenge that Thanos posed to the universe. So the research question for us is our theme, and the question becomes everything you write should relate to it. So if you think about what's the theme of your article, it should be your research question. And if something that you're writing about doesn't help address or speak to your research question, then you may want to reconsider whether or not that should be part of your story. And that's where the storylines come in. These are the specific paths that each character takes. So you may have multiple characters who have somewhat separate paths, but they have to intersect at some point. You can't just be essentially telling two separate stories at the same time, and there's no point at which the different characters in their storylines intersect with each other. And you may find that certain characters start on the same path, but they split and follow different paths moving forward. One of the challenges you often find is that people put too many storylines into their paper. And so what we often see is that every time you introduce a new construct, they introduce a new theory, and that new theory becomes a new storyline. And you end up with, if you've ever gotten feedback that there's too much going on here, you're introducing too many theories, that means you've got too many storylines. And Stephen King told a great story about this when he was writing his book, The Stand, which ended up being like a, 800 or 900 page, massive story. And the way about 99% of the world's population getting wiped out by a virus, and what happened after that. But the way he had started his book was that every chapter introduced a new character, and each character had their own storyline, and they all started to intersect and go together. And half the people, the good people, went to Boulder, Colorado, and the bad people went to Las Vegas. And he said he's about 500 pages into writing the book, and he was in danger of falling apart because he had just too many storylines going and he couldn't resolve them all. So his solution was to plant a bomb in each place and blow up half the characters, so that way he could just evaporate their storylines. And we can't do that, but we can cut and use our delete key to effectively blow up storylines and take out, if we're getting too many theories and too many storylines, it becomes too hard to follow. Then we can delete them to try to focus them, and questioning how they relate to our research question or our theme can be one way to do that. So try to avoid that. So oftentimes you'll hear people talk about plot-driven versus character-driven stories. And if you talk to many writers, they're mostly, so Anne Lamott, Stephen King, others who have written these memoirs and written about writing, they're very much in the character-driven camp. A character-driven story is where you put a character in a situation and then see how they behave. A plot-driven story is you have a conclusion that you want to get to, and then you work the story in a way that it gets to that conclusion. And if you've ever read a academic journal article or somebody's paper, or reviewed a paper that seems really forced, and that a lot of people, and that you don't really buy it, the characters don't really fit, the action isn't believable, why would it happen that way as opposed to this other way? Those tend to be plot-driven stories. So I advocate for thinking about, as you develop your story, be a little bit more flexible, know who your main characters are, know what your theme is, and then as you're writing your story, see how it evolves. Don't try to force the story onto your data or onto your results. Let it come to you as you work through and think through, well, what should happen next? How would this one likely respond? Why would this be the case? And that'll help you develop a more interesting character-driven story that has a plot to it, but you don't start with the plot. You start with the characters, and the plot emerges as the characters start interacting and as you start telling your story. So let me give you an example here of what this looks like. So this is a paper that I published in 2010 with Mike Farr and Violina Rindova. This was actually the dissertation paper from Mike's dissertation. So Violina was his chair, I was on his committee, and Mike had read our 2006 paper on firm celebrity and wanted to test the theory in his dissertation, which is a pretty gutsy move given nobody had ever done it before. There were no established measures of firm celebrity and so forth. So that's what we did in this paper. And so the start of the paper and our exposition, the way we started out was we first established the conversation that we were going to be a part of. And we did this by moving from broad literatures or categories into more specific categories and constructs. So we started out talking about intangible assets, and then moved on to social approval assets as a particular type of intangible asset. And within that class of social approval assets, we then said we're focusing specifically on reputation and celebrity, and defined each of them. And these were the main characters in our story. So we introduced them early. We defined the constructs in the introduction. And then we went about describing the existing literatures and their problems. The main problems we saw was that there's generally a focus on general performance effects, but they've not really been a focus on specific effects and how the different social approval assets could influence them, and that the literature generally failed to adequately discriminate among constructs, that both theoretically and empirically. The social approval assets literature at the time was really kind of a mess. There's lots of different definitions, and the definitions conflated different constructs, and people use the same measures for different constructs and so forth. And so these were a lot of problems that we said, hey, with the literature that we want to address. So our theme was that reputation and celebrity have different effects and outcomes because of differences in how they create value, which we call their sociocognitive content. So we introduced this idea that these things are going to, so we have two different storylines. We have one for reputation, one for celebrity, and that they're going to have different effects on same firm outcomes. But we're going to explain why and give the story and how they create value. So we defined our constructs as our first two storylines. Then we introduced our context, which is earning surprises, foreshadowed the results, and described our contribution. That was the introduction. But we also, part of the exposition for us was at the beginning of the theory development section, because what we did then was, rather than getting into developing our theoretical arguments right away, we talked about our research context first, because our research context, earning surprises, has been studied a lot in accounting and finance, but not as much in management. And it was also a supporting character because it was one of our dependent variables. So we had two different sets of hypotheses that we developed, one focusing on positive and negative earning surprises as the outcome of our story, and the other being how the market reacted to positive and negative earning surprises when firms had them. And so we had to lay out and explain what they were, why they were consequential, why markets reacted to them in different ways, because they were important supporting characters for us. But our study isn't about earning surprises per se. It's about our theme of how reputation and celebrity create value in different ways. So we set up our supporting characters, explained our context, and then we're able to move on to our rising action. In the rising action, we established theoretical underpinnings for building our hypotheses. So first, we described how reputation and celebrity are gained, because these mechanisms are critical to understanding our hypothesized effects and relationships. We then developed our hypotheses in two sets of hypotheses, and so these were the intersecting storylines. So we brought celebrity together in two different ways. So the first set of hypotheses were about how reputation and celebrity affected the likelihood that firms would experience positive and negative earning surprises, and we expected them to have different effects. And the second set was about how reputation and celebrity affected the market's reactions when a firm did have a positive or a negative surprise. So there are a couple of complications we had to address. One is that visibility, both these are multidimensional constructs, and visibility is a part of both of them. So we had to separate, explain how this wasn't just a visibility story, but how these different constructs are actually different from each other, and different from visibility. And the other challenge we had is that, and especially with the second set of hypotheses, we expected their effects to be in the same direction. So we expected them to both have increased the positive effect and both reduce the negative effects. So therefore, we had to then theorize about the relative effects, which one would have a bigger effect than the other, so that we could create the tension in our story about which one would work and why they would work and how they would work differently. The methods was also part of our rising action. So we had to provide details about our empirical context and sample. We did a match sample. We had explained how we first identified all high reputation firms, over a period of time, and then we matched our sample. And then we matched another set of firms who weren't high reputation to these firms, and then used that pool of firms to develop our celebrity measure. So then we had to define and justify our key measures. Celebrity was new. Nobody's ever done it before at this point. There's no precedent for a firm celebrity measure. So we had to spend a lot of time explaining and justifying how we were going to go about measuring this construct. And there are also different ways to measure reputation, and we are actually only interested in high reputation. So we had to justify and explain why and how we're going to compare high reputation and operationalize that, as opposed to firms from low to high reputation, because it's only the high levels that would serve as an intangible asset. And then we also had to talk about how and why we operationalize positive and negative earning surprises, because we wanted to have them be material surprises. So a big one, not just missing it by a penny, but missing it by a significant amount. We then defined and justified our control variables, who were our ensemble. And then finally, we explained our analytical approach for each of the hypotheses. So we did random effects with GEE for predicting surprises, and then we did an event study with t-tests for assessing the effects on market reactions. So that's all laid out, the rising action. So now at this point, the knot's fully tied. So we're at our climax, we're at the beginning of the results section. We're waiting for the following action to start. We present our descriptive statistics, our collinearity diagnostics, how we're structured our tables. Model 1 includes this, model 2 includes that kind of stuff. And everybody's like, okay, let's get to the results. So then we got to our following action. Here we presented our first set of hypothesis results. With regard to predicting positive surprises, our hypotheses were supported. Reputation decreased the likelihood of a positive earning surprise, and celebrity increased it. When it came to negative surprises, our hypotheses were not supported. Neither one of them had a significant effect on the likelihood of a negative surprise. We then presented our second set of hypothesis test results. The first one, positive surprise, we found that positive surprises were supported. They both had positive effects, and celebrity had a larger positive effect than reputation because of its basis in emotion as opposed to analytical information processing. The second set of hypotheses were about negative surprises, and we argued that they would both significantly reduce the negative effect of a negative surprise, which they did. They effectively wiped it out. There was no abnormal return for a negative earnings surprise if a firm has high reputation or celebrity, but their effects were not significantly different from each other. So our last hypothesis was not supported. They both worked, but one didn't work more than the other. We then conducted a bunch of robustness tests, which largely confirmed our primary analysis, so there weren't any new twists there. The most important ones were we had to establish boundary conditions for our cutoffs, because we had established cutoffs for what would be included, be as a celebrity or not, high and included as a celebrity or not, and we tried different levels of that to show that our results were robust. So the beginning of our discussion section, in our case, was also part of the following action. We did something a little unusual here, in that we had one more post hoc analysis that, rather than including that in the results section, we put it in the beginning of the discussion section. And what we did here was, one of the challenges was I talked about was understanding how is this different than divisibility. So we had to decompose our celebrity measure, and we compared both celebrity and firms that were celebrities and firms that were high reputation with firms that were high visibility only, to show that they had different effects. And then we also compared these things to the emotional component of our celebrity measure to show that that was also different too. So that wasn't just driving the results, that celebrity itself was a distinct construct that has effects different from each of its constituent components. And we felt that fit a little bit better, was easier to explain in the context of our discussion section. So that fell here. And our denouement. So in the rest of the discussion, we discussed our contributions to research on intangible assets and social approval assets, the value that social approval assets bring, how they can create value in different ways, and based upon their sociocognitive content. And we established celebrity as a distinct content and showed the role of affect in markets. One of the cool things here we did was then we put reputation and celebrity on their own paths. So we're able to say, hey, now they can go in these different journeys because they work in different ways. They have these different ways of creating value. And so now we can think about them differently and not just lump all these things together. We discussed our limitations of future research directions, practical contributions, but we didn't have a clear contribution, so shame on us. We just kind of let it peter out after that, and we didn't have a final really good concluding paragraph. So, which I'm of course embarrassed about now, but it happens. So that's the end of my kind of formal presentation. I'm going to stop sharing this, and I want to answer your questions. So Kijang, I think you wanted to take the lead on the curated questions first, right?
Yes. Thank you, Tim, for a great presentation. So we've actually condensed some of the questions from our audience. So the first one would be, What are the effective strategies for incorporating one's own voice into a paper while maintaining the integrity of citations?
That's a good question. I mean, it's figuring out what your voice is and how to write is important. So citations should help support your story, and you can use quotes selectively because sometimes it's easier to just to quote somebody else, especially if you're using a definition or adopting a definition that's been used in the previous literature. It's important, I think, to quote it directly if you can, because in that way, because slight differences in wording can make a big difference in meaning and interpretation, how you would operationalize things and construct validity. So those things I like to quote, but how you talk about things, how you tell the story, the type of language you use, that's your voice. And so, you can try to, in most writers, when they very first start writing, they try to imitate somebody else's voice or style that they admire, or maybe try to integrate a couple different ones, but you'll eventually develop your own. And it's important to try to, how do I want to sound? What do I want to say? And then using those citations to support what it is that the story that you're telling. So it's like, so if you just say this study says this study said that, this study said this, all you're doing is describing studies. That's a lit review. That's not or an annotated bibliography. That's not telling the story. How you combine these things together is what parts you emphasize when you present it, even like how you use punctuation. If anybody has looked at any of my stuff, I'm a fan of using hyphens oftentimes to set off asides and so forth in my story. Sometimes I use commas, sometimes I use parentheses, but I use hyphens, as well. And just the way you go about doing that and how you combined information is your voice. And so I would say that'd be a major way to kind of maintain it, is just to think about how it is you want to tell the story. I mean, does that help?
Yeah, I think that also sort of answers our third question as well, which was just how not sound like a review article while also using storytelling in academic writing. So yeah, I think that clarifies a lot. I think for the fourth question was how to connect and bridge different paragraphs to build a strong story. So that was another question.
Yeah, and that's a really good question, because a lot of times, if you get feedback that this seemed to come out of nowhere, or why are you talking about this now? How do you make these transitions from one section to the next? Some of it is the structure, and you can do signposting. You can set up. You can use a rhetorical question perhaps to set up a different, to set up the next section. So, I'll use that as a transition, oftentimes. So there are different ways to do it, but if you think about your story, why are you introducing particular pieces of information and when, and how are you building the relationships? And so if you've in the introduction kind of provide a thumbnail sketch of your entire paper, that can help. But then even just saying how, talking a little bit about, doing a little exposition about what you're going to be doing in this section, or what's going to be coming, what's going to be coming next, or alluding to things in the future, or foreshadow where you're going to be going. So, as we'll discuss, and you mention something, and then you go on, so people know you're going to get to it. Those sorts of transitions can help you move from one piece to the next. But you got to think about, if I'm going to be introducing a construct, why am I introducing it? Where did it come from? How can I bring this into the story and find a way to kind of weave that in so it doesn't seem like it's coming out of nowhere. You don't have to say, now I'm going to do this and now I will do this every time, because that gets kind of stilted and boring to read as well. So you can kind of over signpost, I think, sometimes, but doing it in subtle and different ways as you become a better writer. And look at how other people do it. One of the things I did when I was an assistant professor, and then I encourage everybody to do, is pick one or two articles that you really like, not just for the content, but how it was written, that you think are just great, well-written articles, and go through sentence by sentence, paragraph by paragraph, and look at, not how did they put this together? When do they talk about different things? How do they make these transitions? And that'll start to give you some sense of how to go about doing this yourself. And then a lot of times it's practice and trial and error, and seeing if people buy it, or if the story works, or if you need to make changes.
I see. Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you so much. I think Also, could you just go more specific? So our final question from the audience, were there many ways to tell a story, how to choose the best way for a specific study? I think you've sort of got into this in comparison using the Freytag's pyramid with
Mhm.
difference between qualitative and quantitative. But could you go a little bit more specifically into how would you sort of find what would be the best way for a study going on?
Okay. In some ways, the only way you know what's the best way is what resonates with audiences. So, but and part of that is getting friendly feedback. So that's doing presentations. If your school, if your school has a brown bag series, presenting to other to your department, to colleagues, and even if it doesn't, get some people together in a room and say, hey, can I present my paper to you? I want to see what you think. And getting that sort of feedback, getting friendly reviews early on and asking people, does this make sense? Is this structured effectively? If you just say, hey, can you give me feedback with no direction, you might get stuff that helps, you might not. If there are certain things you want to know, when you ask somebody for a friendly review, tell them what you're most concerned with, and then say, if there's anything else you notice, please let me know. But these are specific issues that I would really like some feedback with. Is this working for you? Does this make sense? Was this confusing? Do I need to elaborate on this more? Can I cut this back? So you'll have some sense of how your story reads, and then how to structure it. This really almost becomes an evolutionary process. So sometimes you'll struggle with it, and I've one of the exercises I put on my website is I call theory and hypothesis Tetris, but you can do this with any paper. It's the idea is that you take each paragraph and systematically move the different things around. So have the move the like your description of your theoretical content or your research context from the beginning to the end, and maybe put things in different orders. And how should the hypotheses build? Does it make sense to have them go in a certain direction versus another one? Which one should be the first hypothesis? Which one the second, and so forth? And just play around with it and just cut and paste and read it to yourself and say, does this make sense, or does it not? Do I understand this better? Because sometimes things just fall into place when you do that. It's like, wow, I never thought about doing it that way, but this really works. And so, it's you got to give yourself enough time and latitude to practice and to play with this stuff and to rewrite. Don't think you just write it once and it's ready to go and you're going to send it off. Rewriting, that my favorite quote from William Zinsser is rewriting is rewriting is the essence of writing well. It's where the game is won or lost. And I love that quote because it's in that rewriting process and putting these things together and trying to tell it in different ways that we tend to find the best structure for that particular story.
I see.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Before we open the floor to the audience, I just
Uh-huh.
wanted to ask you a question of mine that I
Yeah.
actually had. So
Sure.
it's related to chapter 12 within your
Uh-huh.
book. So my question was, how do you flexibly adjust your story amidst receiving tough reviewer comments?
So, um, so you got to look at tough in what way, that they're not buying and that they're not
Yeah,
buying the story, or
sometimes almost they ask that they have some sort of points that they want for me to address, almost like restructuring the storyline.
yeah,
And how would you sort of incorporate all those comments? Some I feel that are extremely tough. So it's sort of related to like the flexibility and how to really sort of redevelop a storyline
yeah,
during this process. Yeah.
yeah. So first of all, you don't have to do everything a reviewer says. So, and if different reviewers are suggesting do you do different things, you're going to have to pick. And so, what you want to do is you want to address if something's not working for them, then that means you're not telling your story effectively enough. It's not just that they're an idiot, they might be, but typically it's going to be because you're not telling your story well enough. And so you want to think about, okay, how can I address what is their real concern? What is the real issue underlying their comment? And does their suggested solution actually address it, or is it going to make it worse, or create other issues? And so sometimes what I'll do is I'll say, I think what you're really saying, or what I'm hearing from you is this, or we tried that and it didn't work for these reasons. So, but to address your concern, we did it this way. So you want to figure out, okay, what are they not getting or what's not working for them or for, for different reviewers, and then, adjust how you tell your story in a way that it solves that problem without introducing new ones. But you want to acknowledge their recommendation, even if you don't take it. And say, I understand what, and I apologize if this is confusing. We think this was the problem. We've done this. Hopefully it's clearer now. And, if it's still not working for you, please let us know. We can continue to revise it, that kind of thing. So you show you're open. You don't just say, we didn't like that. We didn't want to do that. We did this, and if but what you can't do is just leave it the same and tell them why they were wrong. So you gotta,
Yeah.
but you don't have to do everything they said. There may be things that they want you to do that don't really fit or that don't fit your theme or be introducing a storyline that you don't want to take. And one of the things I often do then is I put that in there as a future research direction in the discussion section. So I understand that is really interesting. That's not really where we're going with this story, or we don't have the data to test that story, whatever it is. However, we do think that's an important question. So we now list it as a direction for future research on page whatever, so that they can go, look and see that you're acknowledging the input, even if you're not going to take your story that way.
I see. Thank you so much. It clarifies a lot.
Yeah.
We also have some questions from the audience, so I'll first go over the chat. So there's one question from Matthias Warner.
Uh-huh.
So what he asked is, I wonder whether you can name an excellent qualitative paper, which is excellent when it comes to storytelling.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of them. I think Mike Pratt's 2000 paper on Amway and ambivalence, I think was really good, really effectively well done. That was his dissertation research. I think almost anything Royston Greenwood has written is very interesting and great, has great storytelling to it. I was just reading, I'm using one of his papers in my class. I'm doing the section on what's different about theory and qualitative papers tomorrow in my writing seminar. And I'm using the paper, the Domestri and Greenwood 2016, I think it was, on Grappa, on how on status and radical status recategorization. I think that's a really cool historical paper that does a really nice job with kind of the thick description of background is more of a historical analysis, where Mike's was more of an ethnography. So there are two very different types of stories. One's very much a first person story, and the other one's telling a third person story. And so those were ones I would a couple that I would recommend. So I'm trying to figure out why I can't see the chat. No, there it is. Okay. Okay, now I can see them too. Okay.
Yeah. We have another question.
Sure.
Amersalar Jafari. I think it's a fun question, maybe to lighten up the mood as well. Who are
Sure.
your favorite fiction authors and poets?
So you probably guessed Stephen King's one of my favorite fiction authors. I don't read poetry, so sorry I don't have any poets for you. I read Grisham, John Grisham. There's a writer named Kelly Armstrong who's written. So I like a lot of like sci-fi, and that's not I mean, sci-fi is fine. I like fantasy novels, things that have like people with superpowers. That's kind of what I like. So a lot of fantasy. Of course, J.K. Rowling. The Harry Potter stories I think are fantastic. I've read all of those. Some of them some of them are not. Their prose can be a little stilted or kind of or formulaic sometimes, but what I like about them is the stories that they suck you in, they drag you along. You're instantly interested in the characters and where things are going, and that's what really ties me into the some of these authors.
Mhm. So do you sort of apply, just related to it, do you apply maybe within, for example, you mentioned like character driven. So do you sort of maybe imagine like these different constructs, these different characters in academic papers and then almost personify them to see how would they go about on to reach this plot, for example?
Um, Can you say that again? I was just trying to look at the chat and see if I could post something, but
Oh, it
so
was just a quick question
yeah,
related
yeah.
to it. So would you, for example, you've mentioned before like character-driven
Mhm.
ways, and then do
Yeah,
you almost sort of personify these different characters or different constructs in the academic journal writing process and see
yes,
how they would sort of go about into the plot and sort of interconnect them in that sense?
yes, I do. I hope, I don't know if you guys can hear that banging above me. I apologize. They're doing construction upstairs. So I can't get away from construction. But yes, I do. So when I'm interested in a construct, I do put them in the stories. But as I try to think about, because I'm not an X theorist, I don't say I start with this one theory and that's all I do. So I draw from a bigger grab bag of theories. I tend to start with the phenomenon, but say, okay, what's the theoretical question that's interesting here that I can answer or can understand by studying this phenomenon? And then those constructs become my players, and how I tell their stories, how I look at them interacting. I use a lot of moderators in my studies and contextualize and put boundary conditions on the journey that something's taking, for example. And so I'll look at, okay, how would I expect this to work? Why would I think this would be different? Not that I want to get this result, but I start with, here's a character, here's a characteristic of the situation. How do I go about dealing with this? How do I think that they would play out, and what do I think the result would be? And sometimes, my co-authors and I will be debating, okay, do we think this is going to be a positive effect, a negative effect? What's going to dominate, and as the whole story coheres, then you pull it together. And sometimes characters end up on the cutting room floor. So I'll have something I think might be a player in this story and decide, it's one too many. I got too many storylines going, or it's kind of taken in a different direction. This is a cooler story that we have here, and so let's go with this framing. And so that means these characters and not these other characters. So it's a back and forth. But I definitely start with the characters and try to think about how they're going to interplay with each other, and not here's the result I want to show.
I see. Yeah, thank you for sharing your insights. I think
Yeah.
we could, just for like the maybe last few questions, could we open the
Uh-huh.
floor to the audience so they could just open their mic and then ask some
Sure.
questions?
Yep. Speak up, folks. It's okay.
Excuse me, can I have one question? It's about very interesting sharing, and the question is about the characteristic-driven story and the data and the plot-driven paper.
Mhm.
Is the characteristic story more the data-driven paper, and
Mhm.
the plot-driven paper more of the theory-driven paper? Thanks.
Sorry, I was trying to post the papers for you guys. So could you say that one more again about the plot and character driven? What was your question again, please?
Yeah, is it the characteristic-driven paper more
Yeah,
the data-driven paper, and
yeah.
the plot-driven paper more of the theory-driven paper?
Mhm. So
Can I think like that, or
yeah. I mean, I mean, data there. So I think of being like phenomenon driven as opposed to data driven. And I think that either one can be character driven. So but if you think about why are you looking at the data that you are, what are you trying to find? Because if you're just throwing together if you're just data dredging and doing what we call dust bowl empiricism, you're just throwing everything together and saying, okay, I'm gonna try all these interactions and throw all these things into models, and these things have stars on them, so therefore that's what I'm going to present. That's not really a story. And so so even if you've got a data set that you've inherited from somebody else, you might say, okay, what question do I want to what do I want to know? What can I look at? What interesting questions can I answer using this data? And then that's the story. And then who are the characters that I want to focus on? So if I've got, if you've got a data set with 100 variables in it, you're not going to throw 100 in and see what happens. Which ones are the most important? What do you want to try to explain? you know, and who's the main character and supporting character can change over time. So you might start out thinking this paper is about this, and you discover or realize that, hey, this character is not as important as I thought they were, but this one's a lot more interesting. And so as you're working on the study, who becomes a star in the, you know, in your story may even end up changing over time. So you know, so I tend to think about, you know, because a plot-driven story is going to be much more, I want to achieve this outcome, and then how do I work backwards to getting to that outcome? And so I think, you know, I think when you see a paper that's, but you know, Harking tends to lead to be more plot-driven. It's like that's where we're, you know, we get our results and then we try to go back and retrofit a story to the results. That's more plot-driven. So
Thanks so much.
yeah.
Yeah, I think maybe one final question from the audience. Yes. Yeah, if not, then I think it's about time. So I think we can conclude the webinar session. I just want to thank you so much on behalf of the IM Division Committee, Tim, for your time and a great presentation on storytelling. So thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you. It was my pleasure. Hopefully it was helpful to everybody. And I put the two articles that I mentioned specifically in the chat so that people could, if you want to look at them, you can find them.
All right.
Right.
Yeah, you can see them in the chat. So yeah, so I think we can conclude the seminar. So thank you so much. And then
Yep, my pleasure. And there's a question about, is this recorded? The answer is yes. So you're posting this on your YouTube channel, right?
yes, that's correct. Yeah.
All right. Great.
Hope to see you in AIB or A1.
All right. I will be in Chicago this summer, so I'll see you
All right.
then.
That's great.
Thank you very
All
much.
right. Thanks,
so
everybody.
much.
Thanks for tuning in, especially those of you who are up late.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.